It's Thursday, March 16. Welcome to Business Incorporated, coming to you live from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm Chimize Obi Iwago. Coming on the show, South Africa's antitrust watchdog plans July hearing on banks in FX collusion case. Rwanda's economy grows by 5.9% in 2016. Plus, global markets continue to digest Federal Reserve's rate hike. Let's get started. And of course, we're beginning with the markets, and here in Africa, a widely anticipated U.S. interest rate hike combined with a dovish outlook for the future path of rates lifted most markets. The South African and the Egyptian markets were up at intraday, trading higher at 1.50% and 1.20%. However, the mood is not the same here in Nigeria, as the all-share index tilted south at midday. Kenya's market closed down 1.18% on Wednesday. Meanwhile, South Africa's rand hovered near a 19-month high against the dollar early today after the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates on Wednesday but signaled a gradual pace of rate hikes for the rest of the year. The rand traded at 12.8125 per dollar, flat from its New York close, after rallying to 12.77 late on Wednesday in the wake of the Fed's press conference. Analysts say the rand has shifted to the stronger end of its range following the dovish Fed hike, but does not look like it can break stronger. Still in South Africa, the Competition Tribunal will hold a hearing in July where banks accused of colluding to rig the rand currency will make their submissions. South Africa's Competition Commission said last month it had found more than a dozen local and foreign banks had colluded to coordinate trading in the rand and the US dollar using an instant chat room called ZAR domination, a reference to the rand's official currency market code. And in the Middle East, the markets were up after the U.S. Federal Reserve hiked interest rates as expected, but signaled no acceleration in the pace of monetary tightening. However, the Gulf lagged other emerging markets around the world because of concerns that low oil prices and government austerity measures will continue to weigh on corporate earnings. Among planned austerity steps, the Six-Nation Gulf Cooperation Council plans to introduce a 5% value-added tax in 2018. The Saudi stock index rose 1.28% at intraday, while Dubai was up 0.85% and Qatar added 0.52%. Qatar was buoyed by a 1.7% rise in Qatar Industries, although Qatar Navigation sank 3.6% as it went ex-dividend. Abu Dhabi's index was flat at 0.50%, restrained by Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank, which fell 2.4% as it went ex-dividend. In Europe, markets are digesting the U.S. Federal Reserve announcement of a new rate hike and, of course, the Bank of Japan's rates decision. Investors are also looking at Norway's and the UK central bank for the latest rate decisions. Let's chew all of these with my colleague at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, Olaf Krieger. Good afternoon, Olaf. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, it's morning after Fed's rate decision, and of course, today BOJ left its rates unchanged. How are the investors reacting to Fed and BOJ's decisions?
Well, first of all, this decision was highly anticipated, I have to say, but nevertheless, investors are quite satisfied with that because the framework conditions to do so was given. And that means, of course, that the economy in the U.S. is pretty strong. The situation on the labor market is pretty strong. It's always a good sign also for traders and investors here in Europe. But you know, there's another question, another burning question, because what's next? Is this indeed the end of cheap money, or is it just the end of very cheap money? Because we have to know on stock markets around the globe, it's all about liquidity. And there's a lot of liquidity since rates are on record low in the US and also in Europe. So traders and investors are now waiting which kind of strategy and those banks were going to run in the US and, of course, in Europe.
Well, perhaps that could explain why we're seeing the DAX there nose diving this afternoon. Well, let's look at what this would mean for the ECB and the BoE? How are they expected to react when they meet?
Well, basically, I have to say it will put some kind of pressure on the European Central Bank to follow the step from the Federal Reserve in the United States. But, you know, the situation in Europe, and in particular in the Eurozone, of course, is completely different. As we heard, the U.S. economy is pretty strong. And what we can see in the Eurozone, there are so many economies which aren't strong, which are still in trouble, and which still will need some support coming from the European Central Bank, like monetary easing and low interest rates as long as possible. But sooner or later, the question here for traders and investors at the Frankfurt stock market is, of course, they have to deal with less money. That much is for sure.
Well, Olaf, quite a number of earnings coming in today, and of course some couple of company news coming there. Talk to us about Germany's largest airline, Lufthansa.
Well, investors are really delighted, I have to say, and Lufthansa share gained more than 5% after this results, and this is quite remarkable, because we have to keep in mind that there is a lot of competition up in the air due to so many low-cost carriers with extremely cheap ticket prices, low ticket prices, and this is, of course, a huge endeavor for Lufthansa and all other airlines. And as you already mentioned, because the airline benefited from an agreement with the cabin crew to reduce costs, and this puts an end to strikes which literally paralyzed the airline last year.
Well, Olaf, one more day to go. See you tomorrow. We move on now. In the U.S. stock index, futures pointed to a higher trade as the traders eyed a big batch of data and continued to digest the U.S. Federal Reserve's decision to increase interest rates. Initial jobless claims, housing starts, and the Philip Fed Index are all due to be released at 8:30 a.m.